In a quiet neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, where the streets were lined with old brick buildings and the sound of distant trains rumbled through the air every hour, a 10-year-old girl sat alone in her family's small apartment. The living room was modest, faded curtains, a second-hand couch with a blanket draped over one arm, and a coffee table stacked with medical textbooks. Her parents were both nurses, working long shifts at the hospital, often coming home exhausted long after she'd gone to bed. But even in that quiet, worn-down space, something extraordinary was happening, though no one knew it yet. The girl had always been drawn to sound. Not just any sound, but the kind that carried feeling. When she was little, she'd press her ear against the radiator, just to hear the groans and hisses of the old building breathing. She'd hum along to the wind whistling through cracked window panes, and every Sunday, without fail, her grandmother would play old vinyl records on a turntable rescued from a flea market. Those records were treasures: Chopin's Nocturnes, Rachmaninoff's stormy preludes, and the smooth, wandering piano lines of Bill Evans. The girl would sit cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed, letting the music wash over her like a warm bath. She didn't understand the names or the history behind the notes, but she felt them deep in her chest, like they were speaking directly to her. One rainy afternoon, when she was 9, her uncle showed up with a surprise. He'd been cleaning out a neighbor's garage and found an old electronic keyboard, dusty, missing one key but still working. "It's not much," he said, setting it down on the kitchen table, "but maybe it'll keep you busy." She didn't say much. She just ran her fingers over the plastic keys, pressing one softly. A quiet C note rang out. She pressed another, then another. Within minutes, she was trying to copy the melody from a Chopin piece she'd heard the night before. It wasn't perfect, her fingers were small and the keyboard only had 61 keys, but something clicked. It was like her hands already knew where to go, even if her mind hadn't caught up yet. She started practicing every day after school. While other kids watched cartoons or played outside, she sat at that keyboard, repeating phrases over and over until they sounded right. She didn't have sheet music, so she learned by ear, listening to recordings on her parents' old phone, pausing and rewinding until she could mimic the rhythm, the phrasing, the emotion. Sometimes she'd stay up late, headphones wrapped around her ears, fingers moving silently over the keys so she wouldn't wake her little brother in the next room. Her parents noticed, of course. They'd peek in and see her hunched over the keyboard, brow furrowed in concentration, completely lost in her own world. They didn't understand music, but they saw how it calmed her, how it gave her a kind of peace nothing else could. Money was always tight. Groceries were carefully budgeted, clothes came from thrift stores, and piano lessons were simply out of the question. But that didn't stop her. She began writing her own little pieces, short melodies that captured how she felt on certain days. On days when her mom came home crying from a tough shift, she'd play something soft and slow like a lullaby for grown-ups. On days when her brother was sick, she'd make up a cheerful tune with bouncy rhythms to make him smile. She scribbled her ideas on napkins, notebook margins, even the backs of grocery receipts, any scrap of paper she could find. She didn't call them compositions. To her, they were just feelings turned into sound. School wasn't always easy. She was quiet, kept to herself, and didn't join clubs or sports. Kids sometimes teased her for being weird or too serious. But in music class, everything changed. When the teacher played a simple melody on the classroom piano, she could repeat it instantly, note for note. The teacher, a kind woman in her 50s who'd taught in the district for decades, noticed right away. "You've had lessons?" she asked one day after class. The girl shook her head. "No, I just listen." The teacher paused, then gently asked if she'd like to try playing something of her own. Nervous but curious, the girl sat at the piano. Her fingers hovered for a second, then began to move. Softly at first, then with growing confidence. What came out wasn't a pop song or a nursery rhyme. It was something deeper, more complex. A short piece that sounded like rain falling on rooftops, then sunlight breaking through clouds. The teacher didn't say anything at first. She just listened, eyes wide. When it ended, she whispered, "You're something special." That moment stayed with the girl, not because of the praise, she wasn't used to that, but because someone had finally heard her. Not just the notes, but what was behind them. Still, life went on as usual. She kept practicing on her broken keyboard, kept helping her mom fold laundry, kept walking her brother to school every morning. Music was her secret language, her safe place. She never imagined it could be more than that. Then one winter evening, everything shifted. Her school announced a citywide youth talent competition. Entry was free, and winners would get a chance to perform at a downtown arts center. Most kids signed up to sing pop songs or do magic tricks, but her music teacher gently encouraged her to enter. "Just play what you play at home," she said. "The world should hear it." The girl hesitated. Performing in front of strangers? On a real piano? It felt impossible. But something in her teacher's voice, the quiet certainty, made her say yes. The weeks leading up to the audition were filled with nervous energy. She practiced harder than ever, trying to perfect a piece she'd been working on for months. It started with a simple melody, then wove in jazz chords she'd picked up from Bill Evans' records, ending with a cascade of notes that felt like letting go. She didn't have fancy clothes, so her mom took her to a thrift store and found a simple navy blue dress that fit just right. The night before the audition, she laid it out on her bed like it was made of silk. The morning of the competition, she woke before dawn. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Her little brother, sensing her fear, handed her a crumpled drawing he'd made, a stick figure at a piano with a big sun overhead. "You'll be great," he said, though he was only 7. She tucked the drawing into her pocket and walked to the bus stop, keyboard notes running through her head like a prayer. When she arrived at the community center, the place was buzzing. Kids in glittery costumes, parents holding bouquets, judges with clipboards. She felt out of place immediately. No makeup, no sparkles, just her thrift store dress and a grocery bag holding her handwritten sheet music. Mostly just reminders, since she played from memory. Backstage, she tried to calm her breathing. That's when she heard it. A man's voice, loud and laughing. "Look at that one," he said, nodding toward the backstage curtain where she stood. "If that girl actually plays the piano, I'll quit. She looks like she's never touched a real one." The words hit like a slap. She froze. Her face burned. She recognized the man. Greg, the event's stage manager known for his sharp tongue and flashy suits. He was joking with another staff member, clearly not expecting anyone to overhear. But she did, and in that moment shame and anger twisted together in her stomach. She wanted to run, but then she thought of her brother's drawing, of her grandmother's records, of all those nights alone with her keyboard, turning loneliness into music. She straightened her shoulders, took a deep breath, and stepped onto the stage. The spotlight was blinding. The grand piano gleamed under the lights. Real wood, real pedals, real sound. She sat down, placed her hands on the keys, and for a second the world disappeared. Then she began to play. What followed wasn't just a performance. It was a story. Her story told through music. The opening notes were quiet, almost shy, like a child stepping into a big room. Then the melody grew stronger, weaving through jazz harmonies and classical flourishes, building into something powerful and tender all at once. The audience, which had been rustling and whispering, fell completely silent. Even the judges stopped writing. When she reached the final notes, a gentle resolution that hung in the air like a sigh, the room stayed quiet for a full 3 seconds. Then applause erupted, not polite clapping, but a wave of sound that filled the space, loud and warm and real. Backstage, Greg stood frozen. His face had gone pale. He hadn't moved since she started playing. One of his colleagues nudged him. "Well?" the man asked with a smirk. "Still planning to quit?" Greg didn't answer. He just stared at the stage, eyes wide, as if seeing something he couldn't explain. The girl didn't win first place that day. She came in second, behind a teenage violinist with years of training. But it didn't matter. After the show, people came up to her, asking who her teacher was, where she'd studied, if she'd ever considered performing professionally. She just smiled shyly and said, "I just play what I feel." That night, back in her apartment, she sat at her old keyboard again. The keys still stuck sometimes, and one was missing entirely, but when she played, none of that mattered, because now, for the first time, she knew something important. Her music wasn't just for her anymore. It could reach people, move them, maybe even change them. And somewhere in the city, a stage manager named Greg couldn't sleep. He kept replaying those notes in his head, wondering how someone so young, so unassuming, could hold an entire room in the palm of her hand with nothing but a piano and her truth. But that was a story for another day. For now, in a quiet apartment on the south side of Chicago, a girl played on, her Finn. Jers dancing across the keys, turning silence into song. one note at a time. The weeks after the talent competition passed in a blur of ordinary routines, school bells, homework, helping her little brother with his spelling words, folding laundry with her mom on Sunday afternoons. On the surface, nothing had changed. But inside, something had shifted. The girl carried a new kind of quiet confidence, like a secret warmth tucked beneath her ribs. She still practiced every day on her old keyboard. But now, when she played, she imagined someone listening, not just her family or her teacher, but strangers who might feel something real when they heard her music. Her high school music teacher noticed the change right away. "You've got a spark now," she said one afternoon after class, while the girl was tuning the school's out-of-shape upright piano just for fun. "Don't let it fade." She handed her a flyer for a bigger competition, the Chicago Youth Arts Showcase, held downtown at a real theater with proper lighting, a grand piano, and judges from the city's music schools. "This one matters," the teacher added gently. "People go there looking for talent, real opportunities." The girl took the flyer home and left it on the kitchen table. Her parents found it that night after their shifts. They sat at the table in silence for a long time, sipping tea that had gone cold. They didn't know much about music competitions, but they knew what opportunity meant in their world. It meant a chance to rise, to be seen, maybe even to ease the weight they carried every day. Her father, usually quiet and tired, spoke first. "If you want to try," he said, "we'll find a way." But finding a way wasn't simple. Entry was free, but getting downtown meant bus fare, decent clothes, and sheet music printed neatly. Things that added up fast. Her mother started packing lunches instead of buying them at the hospital cafeteria. Her father took an extra weekend shift cleaning office buildings. And the girl? She began tutoring neighborhood kids in math after school, charging just a few dollars an hour. She didn't tell anyone why, just said she wanted to save up for something important. The piece she chose to perform was one she'd been working on for months. It didn't have a name yet, but it told a story, starting with a simple, lonely melody in the left hand like footsteps on an empty street at dawn. Then the right hand entered with a brighter, questioning phrase, hope peeking through cracks in the pavement. As it built, jazz chords layered in, unexpected and warm like kindness from a stranger. The middle section swelled with emotion, almost angry at times, then softened into something tender like forgiveness. She practiced it until her fingers ached, until she could play it in her sleep, until every note felt like a breath she'd been holding. The night before the showcase, she couldn't sleep. Rain tapped against the window, and thunder rumbled in the distance, the kind of storm that used to scare her when she was little. Back then, she'd crawl into her parents' bed, trembling. Now she sat at her keyboard and played softly, turning the storm into music. Her little brother appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. "Can't sleep?" she whispered. He shook his head. She patted the space beside her on the floor. He curled up there, listening as her hands moved over the keys, weaving calm out of chaos. When his breathing slowed into sleep, she carried him back to his bed, then returned to practice one last time. The morning of the showcase, the sky was clear but cold. She wore the same navy blue dress from the last competition. It was the only nice thing she owned, but this time, her mother had carefully steamed the wrinkles out and pinned a small white flower to the shoulder. "For luck," she said, smoothing her daughter's hair. The girl hugged her tightly, then walked to the bus stop with her sheet music in a clean manila folder, and her brother's latest drawing tucked in her pocket, a piano with wings. Downtown Chicago felt like another world. Tall buildings, people rushing in suits and heels, street performers playing saxophones and violins on corners. The theater was grand. Red velvet curtains, a polished wooden stage, and a Steinway grand piano that gleamed under the stage lights. Backstage buzzed with nervous energy. Teens in tuxedos tuned violins. Dancers stretched in corners. A boy no older than 12 practiced a complex drum solo on a practice pad, his brow furrowed in concentration. She found a quiet spot near a stack of stage curtains and sat down, closing her eyes to center herself. That's when she heard the voice again. Seriously? Her again? It was Greg, the same stage manager from the last competition. He stood with another staff member near the prop table, arms crossed, shaking his head. "I saw her at the community center thing. Sweet kid, but she's not ready for this level. Look at her. No fancy shoes, no handler, just alone." His friend chuckled. "Maybe she's here to watch." Greg laughed, a loud, careless sound. If she actually plays the piano today, I'll quit, I mean it. No offense, but she looks like she's never even seen a real grand piano up close. The words landed like stones in her stomach. She kept her eyes closed, but her hands clenched in her lap. She wanted to disappear, to go home and never come back. But then she thought of her father's tired eyes when he handed her the bus fare, of her mother's hands, rough from hospital work, pinning that flower to her dress, of her brother drawing pianos with wings. She opened her eyes, stood up, walked calmly to the sign-up sheet and wrote her name in neat letters. Backstage, the order of performers was posted. She was number 7, right after a cellist and before a tap dancer. As the show began, she watched from the wings. Each act was impressive in its own way. Flawless technique, years of training, expensive costumes. Doubt crept in again. What am I doing here? But then she remembered, music wasn't about perfection. It was about truth. And she had plenty of that. When her number was called, she walked onto the stage. The lights were brighter than she expected. The audience was larger, rows and rows of faces, some bored, some curious, some already checking their phones. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. She sat at the piano, placed her hands on the keys, took one slow breath and began to play. The first notes were soft, barely more than a whisper, but they cut through the noise of the room like a thread of light. People stopped fidgeting. Phones lowered. Conversations died mid-sentence. By the time the melody fully emerged, the entire theater was still. She didn't think about the notes. She didn't think about Greg or the judges or whether she was good enough. She just played the story, the loneliness, the hope, the anger, the quiet joy. Her fingers moved with a certainty that surprised even her. At one point, during a particularly emotional passage, a woman in the front row wiped her eyes without realizing it. A judge, an older man with silver hair and a stern expression, leaned forward in his seat, his pen forgotten. When the final chord faded into silence, the room didn't erupt right away. It held its breath. Then slowly, one person stood up. Then another. Within seconds, the entire audience was on their feet, clapping, not out of politeness, but out of awe. The sound was overwhelming, a wave of warmth that washed over her like sunlight after a long winter. Backstage, Greg stood frozen near the curtain. His face had gone completely pale. His friend nudged him, grinning. Well, still planning to quit? Greg didn't answer. He just stared at the stage, his usual swagger gone. For the first time in years, he felt small. Not because of shame, but because he'd just witnessed something he couldn't explain. Something raw and real and rare. After the performance, the judges asked her to stay behind. They were kind but serious. "Who was your teacher?" one asked. She shook her head. "I don't have one. I learn by listening." They exchanged glances. Another judge, a woman with kind eyes and a string of pearls around her neck, leaned forward. "Do you compose your own music?" The girl nodded. "Mostly, yes," the woman smiled. "Then you're not just a pianist. You're a composer, and that's something special." They didn't announce winners that night. Results would come by mail. But as she walked out of the theater, a man in a rumpled suit approached her. It was Greg. He looked different, less loud, more uncertain. "Hey," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. I owe you an apology." She looked at him, waiting. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "Dead wrong. You're not just good, I don't even know the right word. But I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've never heard anything like that." She didn't say much, just nodded. "Thank you." He hesitated, then pulled a business card from his pocket. "Look, I know I'm the last person you'd trust. But if you ever want to do more, perform, record, whatever, I'd be honored to help. No charge, I mean it." He handed her the card. She took it, surprised. "Why?" she asked. He looked away for a moment, then met her eyes. "Because sometimes," he said, "you hear something that reminds you why you started loving music in the first place. And I forgot that a long time ago." She tucked the card into her folder next to her brother's drawing. The bus ride home was quiet. The city lights blurred past the window. She didn't know if she'd won, didn't know if anything would come of this night. But for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where music wasn't just her secret. It was her path. When she got home, her parents were waiting up, even though it was past midnight. They didn't ask about the competition. They just hugged her, long and tight. Her little brother ran out in his pajamas, holding up a new drawing. A girl at a piano with a crowd. of people smiling around her. "You did it," he said, beaming. She smiled back. "We'll see." But deep down she already knew. Something had changed, not just in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. She wasn't just a girl with a broken keyboard anymore. She was someone who could speak without words, heal without touching, connect without trying. And that was enough. Weeks later, a letter arrived. She'd won first place, not just in her category, but overall. The prize included a scholarship to a summer music program and an invitation to perform at a city arts gala. Her parents cried when they read it. Her teacher hugged her so hard she couldn't breathe. And Greg? He showed up at her school the next week with a used but well-maintained digital piano. 88 weighted keys, full pedal set. "Consider it a loan," he said, though they both knew it wasn't. She accepted it with quiet gratitude. That night she played on real piano keys for the first time in her own home. The sound was richer, deeper, more alive, and as her fingers danced across the keys, she thought not of fame or prizes, but of all the people who'd believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be doubts, rejections, moments of fear. But in that small apartment with the city humming outside and her family sleeping down the hall, she played on, turning silence into song, one honest note at a time. After the showcase, life didn't suddenly become easy, but it did become different. The letter with the scholarship offer sat on the kitchen table for days, as if the family couldn't quite believe it was real. Her parents read it over and over, their tired eyes scanning the words like they might disappear if looked at too long. The summer program was held at a respected music conservatory 2 hours away, and it included room, board, and daily lessons with professional instructors. For a family that counted every dollar, it felt like a miracle wrapped in plain paper. But miracles come with questions. Who would watch her little brother while she was away? Could she handle being surrounded by kids who'd had private teachers since they were 5? And most of all, was it right to leave even for something this important? Her mother voiced the worry one night over dinner, stirring a pot of soup that had been stretched with extra rice. "What if it's too much?" she asked softly. "What if you feel out of place?" The girl didn't answer right away. She watched her brother draw at the table, this time a picture of her standing on a stage with stars above her head. "I think," she finally said, "that if I don't go, I'll always wonder what could have been." That settled it. Her parents nodded, eyes glistening. They'd find a way. Her aunt would stay with her brother. Her father would pick up extra shifts, and she'd work twice as hard to make it worth it. Before she left for the program, Greg showed up at their apartment again, this time with a worn leather bag slung over his shoulder and a nervous energy in his step. He hadn't been back since delivering the piano, and he looked like he wasn't sure he was welcome. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, holding out a small notebook. "I made a list," he said. "Places you could play when you get back. Open mics, community centers, even a cafe that does Sunday jazz. They won't pay much, but people should hear you." She took the notebook, surprised. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, phone numbers, notes about sound systems, even tips like bring your own extension cord and ask for the piano to be tuned before you play. It was clear he'd spent real time on it. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, not unkindly. Greg shifted his weight. "Because I messed up," he said simply. "And because I've seen a lot of talent come and go. Most of it's polished, rehearsed, perfect. But what you do, it's not just skill, it's soul. And that's rare. Too rare to let it get lost in the noise." He paused, then added, "Look, I know I'm not your ideal manager. I've got a big mouth, I wear loud shirts, and I used to think music was just background noise for fancy parties. But if you'll let me, I'd like to help you share what you've got. With respect, with care, and without taking a single cent until you're ready." Her parents exchanged a look. They didn't trust easily. Years of being overlooked, underestimated, and talked down to had taught them caution. But there was something in Greg's voice that night that wasn't performative. It was humility. Real, uncomfortable, human humility. They agreed, but with conditions. He wouldn't speak for her. He wouldn't push her into anything she didn't want. And her schoolwork, her family, her peace, those came first always. Greg nodded like he'd been waiting for this chance his whole life. "Fair enough," he said. "I'll follow your lead." The summer program was both overwhelming and eye-opening. She arrived with her thrift store suitcase and a heart full of nerves. The other students wore designer clothes, carried expensive instrument cases, and spoke casually about summers in Europe or private lessons with famous teachers. At first, she kept to herself, practicing alone in empty practice rooms late into the night. But slowly, people noticed her. Not because she showed off, but because when she played, even the most confident students would stop and listen. One evening, after a group masterclass, an older instructor pulled her aside. "You've never had formal training, have you?" he asked, not unkindly. She shook her head. He smiled. "That's why your voice is so fresh. You're not copying anyone. You're just you." He offered to give her a few free lessons before the program ended. She accepted gratefully. She learned a lot that summer, not just about technique or theory, but about how music lives in the spaces between notes, in the breath before a phrase, in the silence after a chord. She also learned that talent alone isn't enough. You need support. You need someone who believes in you when you doubt yourself, and sometimes that someone shows up in the most unexpected form. When she returned home, Greg was waiting at the bus station with a thermos of hot chocolate and a list of 3 gigs he'd already booked for her. Small, low-pressure places where she could test the waters. The first was at a neighborhood library during a poetry night. She played between readings simple pieces that matched the mood of the poems. Gentle for love poems, restless for ones about loss. People lingered afterward, not to praise her, but to talk. An elderly man told her music reminded him of his wife, who'd passed the year before. A teenager said it helped her stop thinking about her parents' divorce for a few minutes. That's when she realized her music wasn't just sound. It was a bridge. Greg watched from the back of the room, arms crossed, but his usual swagger was gone. He took notes, not on a clipboard, but in a small journal. Afterward, he didn't gush. He just said, "You connected. That's what matters." The next gig was at a cafe that hosted live jazz on Sundays. It was riskier. Jazz musicians could be tough critics. But she didn't try to impress them. She played her own blend. Classical structure with jazz harmonies, original melodies with improvisational flourishes. Halfway through her set, the regular bass player, a man in his 60s with a salt and pepper beard, nodded from his seat and started playing along, softly, respectfully, adding depth to her chords. By the end, the whole room was swaying. The cafe owner offered her a regular spot. Greg handled everything behind the scenes. He called venues, negotiated fair pay, even if it was just $50 and a meal, made sure the piano was playable, and even waited outside in his old sedan when gigs ran late so she wouldn't have to take the bus home alone. He slept in that car more than once, eating gas station sandwiches and drinking bad coffee, just to be nearby. He never complained, never asked for thanks. Her parents saw the change in him too. At first they watched him like hawks, ready to step in if he overstepped. But over time, they saw how he deferred to her, how he listened more than he spoke, how he'd cancel his own plans if she needed a ride or help printing sheet music. One evening, her mother handed him a plate of leftovers through the apartment door. "You're part of this now," she said quietly. "But don't forget, she's still our child." Greg accepted the plate with both hands. "I won't," he said. "I promise." As the months passed, her confidence grew, not in a flashy way, but in quiet certainty. She started writing more, experimenting with longer pieces, even recording rough demos on her phone. Greg borrowed a friend's basic audio setup and helped her make cleaner recordings in the library's soundproof study room. They weren't professional, but they were honest. He posted a few online, just short clips, no fancy edits, no clickbait titles. Just original piano piece where played live. To their surprise, people shared them. Comments poured in. "This got me through my night shift." "Played this for my daughter before her surgery," she smiled. "Where can I hear more?" She didn't chase fame. She chased truth. And truth, it turned out, had its own kind of magnetism. One rainy November night, after a gig at a community center, Greg drove her home in silence. The windshield wipers thumped a steady rhythm. Finally, he spoke. "You know," he said, eyes on the road, "I used to think managing artists was about connections, money, who you knew. But watching you, it's not about any of that. It's about protecting the thing that makes them them. And your them is pure. I don't want to mess that up." She looked out the window, watching streetlights blur through the rain. "You haven't," she said softly. He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Back at the apartment, her little brother was waiting up, holding a new drawing. This one showed her at a piano with G standing behind her. Not in front, not taking credit, just there like a shadow that chose to stay. "He's on your team now," her brother said matter-of-factly. She smiled. "Yeah," she said. "He is." By the time she turned 18, she'd played over 30 small gigs, built a modest online following, and kept her grades high enough to earn a full scholarship to one of the country's top music schools. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday. Her parents cried again. Her brother taped the letter to the fridge like it was a trophy. And Greg? He showed up with a cake shaped like a piano and a single red rose. But the real test came when record labels started calling. Not the big flashy ones at first, just smaller indie labels who'd heard her recordings and wanted to talk. They offered deals, studio time, marketing plans. Greg handled the calls, but he never made decisions for her. Instead, he sat with her at the kitchen table, reading contracts line by line, explaining terms in plain language, asking hard questions. "Do they want you to change your sound?" he'd ask. "Do they respect your vision? Or do they just see a product?" She turned down 3 offers. Each time, Greg supported her without hesitation. "Your music is yours," he'd say. "Don't let anyone turn it into something it's not." Then came the offer from a respected classical jazz crossover label. They didn't want to change her. They wanted to amplify her. They offered creative control, a modest advance, and a plan to release her debut album exactly as she envisioned it. Greg read the contract twice, consulted a lawyer friend for free, and finally nodded. "This one's different," he said. "They get it." She signed, but only after making one condition. Greg would be her official manager with fair pay and real responsibility. He protested at first. "You don't owe me this," he said. But she looked him in the eye and said, "You've earned it." The night before her first official recording session, she couldn't sleep. She sat at her piano, the one Greg had given her, and played through her entire album, piece by piece. Each song was a chapter of her life. The loneliness, the hope, the storms, the quiet joys. Greg sat on the couch, listening in the dark, his usual loud self completely still. When she finished, he didn't clap. He just said, "You were always great." "I just didn't know how to see it at first," she smiled. "Now you do." "Now I do," he agreed. The next morning, they drove to the studio together, 2 people who'd started on opposite sides of a joke and ended up on the same path, walking side by side. And as the city woke up around them, full of noise and hurry, they carried something rare: trust, built note by note, gig by gig, mistake by mistake. Because sometimes the people who laugh at you first are the ones who end up believing in you the hardest, and sometimes that's exactly what you need to keep playing. The night before the Carnegie Hall performance, the city felt unusually still. Rain had fallen all afternoon, leaving the streets glistening under the streetlights, and now a soft hush hung in the air, as if New York itself was holding its breath. Inside a modest hotel room near the theater district, the girl sat by the window, wrapped in an old sweater her mother had knitted years ago. On the small table beside her sat a framed photo, her family, all 4 of them, squeezed onto their worn living room couch, smiling like they'd just shared a secret joke. Next to it was a stack of letters from fans. A veteran who said her music helped him sleep through nightmares. A young girl who'd started piano lessons after hearing First Light. A teacher who played her pieces during quiet time in class. She didn't feel nervous. Not in the way she used to. Back then, fear had been a knot in her stomach, a voice whispering, "You don't belong here." Now it was different. She felt calm, grounded, like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Not because she'd made it, but because she'd stayed true to why she started in the first place. To turn feeling into sound, and sound into connection. Greg knocked softly on the door before entering. He carried 2 paper cups of tea, her favorite with honey and a splash of lemon, and a small box wrapped in brown paper. "From your brother," he said, handing it to her with a smile. Inside was a new drawing, a grand piano on a stage with a single spotlight shining down, and tiny figures in the audience, her parents, Greg, and even her grandmother, who'd passed years ago but whose records had started it all. At the bottom, in wobbly letters, he'd written, "Play loud. They're listening." She smiled, her eyes stinging just a little. "He's getting better at drawing pianos," she said. "He's getting better at believing in you, Greg replied gently. They sat in silence for a while, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Greg looked older now, not in a tired way, but in a weathered, wise way. The loud suits were gone. The careless jokes had faded. In their place was a man who'd learned that real success isn't measured in applause, but in impact. He'd turned down bigger clients, flashier gigs, even a television offer just to stay by her side. This is enough, he'd told a friend once. More than enough. The next evening, Carnegie Hall glowed under the marquee lights. People arrived in elegant coats and scarves, some holding programs, others clutching tickets like precious things. Backstage buzzed with last-minute checks, tuners adjusting the Steinway, stagehands testing lights, assistants whispering into headsets. But in the green room it was quiet. Just her, Greg, and the steady rhythm of her breathing. Her parents sat in the front row, dressed in their best clothes. Her mother in a deep blue dress she'd saved for years to buy. Her father in a suit he'd had tailored for this night. They held hands tightly, their eyes bright with pride and disbelief. Behind them, scattered throughout the hall, were faces from her journey. Her high school music teacher, the cafe owner who gave her first gig, the elderly man from the library who'd said her music reminded him of his wife. Even the producer from Brooklyn had flown in, sitting quietly near the back. And in the very front row, right beside her parents, sat Greg. He wasn't backstage managing logistics tonight. He'd insisted on being in the audience. I want to hear it like everyone else, he'd said. He wore a simple dark jacket, no flashy tie, and for once he wasn't taking notes. He was just present. When she walked onto the stage, the applause was immediate but not overwhelming. It was warm, respectful, like the audience already knew this wasn't just a performance. It was a conversation. She sat at the piano, placed her hands on the keys and let the silence settle around her. Then she began. She didn't open with something flashy. She started with a piece she'd written at 16, the one she'd played at the youth showcase. The night Greg had laughed and said, "If you play the piano, I'll quit." Now, years later, she played it again, but with deeper hands, a steadier heart, and the wisdom of everything that had happened since. The melody unfolded like a memory, shy at first, then stronger, then full of grace. People leaned forward in their seats. Some closed their eyes. A few wiped tears away without embarrassment. She played for nearly 2 hours. Original compositions, reimagined classics, even a quiet improvisation inspired by the rain the night before. Each piece told a part of her story. The immigrant family's quiet sacrifices, the nights alone with a broken keyboard, the sting of being underestimated, the slow bloom of trust. And through it all, the music never shouted. It whispered, it wept, it laughed, it healed. When she finished the final encore, a new piece called Full Circle, built around a simple lullaby her grandmother used to hum, the hall fell into a silence so deep you could hear a pin drop. Then slowly the audience rose. Not all at once, but wave by wave until the entire room was standing, clapping not just with their hands, but with their hearts. Backstage, she didn't rush to celebrate. She sat on a folding chair, catching her breath, her fingers still tingling from the keys. Greg found her there a few minutes later. He didn't say anything at first, just handed her a bottle of water and sat beside her. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "You did it," he said. "Not just the performance. The whole thing. You stayed you." She looked at him and smiled. "Because people like you let me," he shook his head. "No, because you never let the world change you." Later, during the reception in the grand lobby, she made her way through the crowd, thanking people, hugging old friends, signing a few programs. But her eyes kept scanning the room, searching for something or someone. Then she saw her. Near the grand staircase, half hidden behind a potted fern, stood a young girl. She couldn't have been more than 10 or 11, wearing a second-hand dress that was a little too big, clutching a grocery bag like it held something precious. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the piano that still sat on stage, now empty. She looked nervous, out of place, like she wasn't sure she belonged in a place like this. The girl, now a woman, but still carrying that same quiet heart, walked over slowly. She knelt down so they were eye to eye. "Hi," she said gently. "Did you come to hear the music?" The child nodded, then whispered, "My teacher said I should come. She said, you started like me." "Like you?" the woman asked. "No piano at home, just a keyboard." And I write my own songs. A wave of memory washed over her. The napkins, the grocery receipts, the late nights practicing in silence. She smiled. Then you're already ahead of me, she said. Because I didn't have anyone tell me I could do this. But you do. The girl's eyes lit up just a little. Do you think I could play? Just once on a real piano? The woman didn't hesitate. She stood, took the girl's hand and led her back toward the stage. Security didn't stop them. Greg had already given the nod from across the room. The hall was mostly empty now, just a few stragglers lingering near the exits. The grand piano waited under a single spotlight, silent and ready. Go ahead, the woman said, stepping aside. The girl climbed onto the bench, her feet not quite reaching the pedals. She placed her small hands on the keys, took a deep breath, and began to play. It wasn't perfect. Her timing wavered. Her chords were simple, but there was something in it. A spark, a truth, a voice trying to be heard. From the wings, Greg watched. He saw the woman standing nearby, arms crossed, listening with the same quiet awe he'd felt years ago in a community center. And in that moment, he understood. This wasn't just about one person's success. It was about passing the torch. About making space for the next quiet kid with a grocery bag and a dream. When the girl finished, she looked up, unsure. The woman knelt again. That was beautiful, she said. Keep playing, no matter what anyone says. The girl nodded, clutching her bag like it was a shield. Thank you, she whispered. As they walked out together, the woman handed her a small card, her contact info, no titles, no fancy logo. If you ever need someone to listen, she said, call me. Outside, the city hummed with life, taxis honking, people laughing, music spilling from a nearby bar. But in that moment, everything felt still, like the world had paused to honor a promise being kept. Back in the hotel that night, the woman sat by the window again, this time with a new drawing in her lap, the one her brother had given her. She traced the lines of the piano with her finger, then looked out at the skyline. She thought of her parents, probably asleep by now, dreaming of their daughter on a famous stage. She thought of Greg, finally at peace with the man he'd become. And she thought of the little girl with the grocery bag, whose hands had just touched a grand piano for the first time. She didn't know what came next. Maybe more performances, maybe teaching, maybe writing music for films or hospitals or schools, but none of that mattered as much as this. She'd stayed true. She'd turned pain into beauty, doubt into courage, and silence into song. And in doing so, she'd given others permission to do the same. Later, she opened her laptop and typed a short message to her online followers. No fanfare, no promotion. Just these words, the music isn't about perfection. It's about showing up even when you're scared, even when no one believes in you yet. Especially then. Keep playing. Someone's listening. She hit send, closed the laptop, and walked over to the small keyboard she always traveled with. She played a few quiet notes just for herself, just for the joy of it. And somewhere in a quiet apartment or a school practice room or a basement with a second-hand keyboard, another pair of hands began to move across the keys, turning silence into song, one honest note at a time.